The year is 1533. England stands on a knife's edge. A kingdom torn apart by a king's ambition, a crisis of faith, and the desperate hope for a male heir. King Henry VIII, a man of formidable will and fiery temper, has just ripped his nation away from the authority of Rome. He's defied the Pope, challenged centuries of tradition, all for one single all-consuming dream, a son to secure the Tudor dynasty. But history, as it so often does, has a sense of irony. On a September day, inside the grand but tense walls of Greenwich Palace, a baby's cry echoes through the royal chambers. It is not the cry of a prince, the long-awaited savior of the Tudor line. It is the cry of a daughter. A little girl who, in that moment, is seen as a political disappointment. Princess dismissed at birth, overlooked and underestimated. A child who would one day rise from the shadows of her own tumultuous beginnings to become the most celebrated monarch in English history. Her name was Elizabeth. From her very first breath, Elizabeth Tudor was a child of turmoil. Her existence was a scandal, her future shrouded in uncertainty. Her mother was the captivating and controversial Anne Boleyn. Once a lady-in-waiting to Henry's first wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon, Anne had ensnared the king's heart. Her love affair, passionate, forbidden, and politically explosive, shattered England's allegiance to the Catholic Church. It split the conscience of the realm and placed the English crown in open defiance of the most powerful religious figure in Europe. Elizabeth's birth wasn't just a royal event. It was a revolution wrapped in swaddling clothes. She was the living, breathing symbol of her father's rebellion, the embodiment of the new English Reformation. She was the fragile link connecting the crown's power to this new, contested faith. While Henry tried to mask his profound disappointment with lavish christenings and public celebrations, the truth hung heavy in the air. This was not the son he had gambled his kingdom for. Too many Elizabeth's birth felt less like a blessing and more like a bitter reminder that England's future was as uncertain as ever. Her first few years were a whirlwind of fleeting fortune. Raised in magnificent palaces like Hatfield and Eltham, she lived amidst the glittering spectacle of Tudor royalty. But even surrounded by silks and jewels, danger was a constant, silent companion. Her mother Anne Boleyn, brilliant, ambitious, and utterly magnetic, was a queen who inspired both fervent adoration and deep-seated hatred. To her enemies, she was a manipulative seductress and a heretic. To her supporters, she was a champion of reform and a queen of rare intellect. But to little Elizabeth, she was simply mother. That bond, however, would be severed before it could even take root in memory. In May of 1536, when Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old, the world came crashing down. Anne Boleyn was arrested. The charges were shocking: adultery, incest, and high treason. They were lies, of course. Accusations carefully crafted from political malice and courtly conspiracy to clear the way for a new wife, a new hope for a son. Under the grim, gray skies of London, within the cold stone walls of the Tower, a French swordsman brought Anne Boleyn's life to an end. In that single, brutal moment, Elizabeth's world was shattered. She became an orphan and an outcast. The king, her own father, declared her illegitimate, stripped her of the title of princess, and cast her to the very margins of the royal succession. And yet it was here, in the ashes of this family tragedy, that the first embers of her future greatness began to glow. Even as a child exiled from the center of power, Elizabeth started to reveal the traits that would one day define her reign: astonishing resilience, a razor-sharp intellect, and a preternatural sense of composure in the face of chaos. She was given an education fit for a king, learning from the finest humanist scholars of the age, like Roger Ascham. She didn't just learn languages, she mastered them. Latin and Greek flowed from her tongue as easily as her native English. She spoke French, Italian, and later Spanish with a fluency and grace that would one day disarm foreign ambassadors. But for Elizabeth, knowledge was never just an academic exercise. It was a tool for survival. In a court that ran on whispers, secrets, and hidden daggers, she learned that her greatest weapon was her mind. She perfected the art of silence. She learned to watch, to listen intently, and to speak only when her words could decisively shape her destiny. While others foolishly underestimated the forgotten little girl, She was studying them all, every subtle glance, every whispered scheme, every calculated betrayal. She was a silent apprentice in the brutal school of power. From her father Henry, she inherited a commanding presence and a fiery spirit. From her mother Anne, she inherited a quick wit and an undeniable charm. When combined, these traits formed a rare and powerful alchemy, forging a future queen from both unyielding passion and cool, calculating reason. As she grew from a child into a young woman, the dangers around her only multiplied. Each of her father's subsequent marriages, 6 wives in total, brought new uncertainties, new stepmothers, and a constantly shifting political landscape. Every execution, every fall from grace, was another stark lesson in the lethal perils of power. She learned early on that to be beloved by Henry VIII could be a death sentence, that sometimes the safest place to be was forgotten. By the time the great formidable king finally died in 1547, Elizabeth was 13 years old. She had survived 3 stepmothers after her own mother's execution. She had seen her place in the world rise and fall with the whims of powerful men. She had navigated a childhood that would have broken most people. But from this crucible of chaos, what emerged was not a broken, fearful child. It was a young woman of remarkable strength, perception, and self-control. The prologue to her story was not one of easy triumph, but of sheer, unyielding endurance. Born to a father who never truly wanted her, and a mother who was destroyed by the very ambition that placed her on the throne, Elizabeth learned the most fundamental lesson of her life. Survival is its own form of victory, and from that hard-won survival, something far greater was destined to emerge, a reign that would define an entire era, a legacy that would outshine all the turmoil of her birth. She was, and would forever remain, the daughter of discord who rose to become the legendary Virgin Queen. The journey to the throne wasn't paved with gold and celebration. It was forged in shadow, fire, and the silent, watchful endurance of a forgotten child. Our story begins not with a crown, but with a catastrophe. The year is 1536. A little girl, not yet 3 years old, loses her mother. But this isn't just any loss. Her mother is Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, and her death is a brutal public execution, ordered by her own husband, King Henry VIII. For the child Elizabeth, the world shatters overnight. One moment, she is Princess Elizabeth, the celebrated heir, the living symbol of her father's break with the old church. The next, she is nothing. Stripped of her title, she becomes simply the Lady Elizabeth. Her birth, once a national triumph, is now declared illegitimate, a royal mistake to be quietly erased. She is cast out of the line of succession, her future plunged into a terrifying uncertainty. How could a toddler comprehend such a fall? She couldn't. But the consequences would shape every single day of her young life. She was now a ghost at court, a living reminder of a queen her father was desperate to forget. Yet there was one undeniable truth that Henry, in all his tyrannical power, could never truly erase. She was still his daughter, and she looked just like him. The same fiery red-gold hair, the same piercing, intelligent eyes, the unmistakable Tudor spirit burning within her. Henry was a man of contradictions. He could never quite disown the child who was such a clear mirror of himself. So Elizabeth's childhood became a dangerous, dizzying dance between royal recognition and cold rejection. One day, Henry would proudly parade her before foreign ambassadors, boasting of her sharp wit and fluency in multiple languages. He would show her off as proof of his own magnificent lineage. But the next, she would be cast back into obscurity, her household staff reduced, her finances cut. Left to wonder if she had been forgotten entirely. She was a pawn in the high-stakes game of her father's ever-shifting affections and his rapid succession of new wives. Through this chaos, Elizabeth learned a crucial lesson very early on. To be loved by King Henry was a dangerous and often fatal position, but to be ignored by him, that was how you survived. She learned to be quiet, to be observant, to make herself small and unassuming. Survival was her first and most important education, and she had so many teachers. As a procession of stepmothers came and went, Elizabeth watched, listened, and learned from the fates of the queens who followed her mother. From the gentle Jane Seymour, she saw that even delivering a male heir, one thing Henry craved above all else, only brought fleeting favor and couldn't save you from death. From Anne of Cleves, the Flanders mare, she learned a brutal lesson in court politics, that a queen's appearance, her portrait, could seal her fate before she even set foot in the country. Power was tied to perception. Then came the tragedy of her young cousin, Catherine Howard. Beautiful, vivacious, and foolishly romantic, Catherine's rise was as swift as her fall. From her, Elizabeth learned the most terrifying lesson of all, that youthful passion and a king's affection could lead directly to the executioner's block. Love, in the Tudor court, was a death sentence. Finally, a glimmer of stability arrived with Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, your kind, and a dedicated scholar. Catherine became the closest thing Elizabeth had ever known to a mother. She created a warm, nurturing environment, championing Elizabeth's education and treating her with genuine affection. For the first time, Elizabeth felt a sense of safety. Catherine Parr taught her that knowledge was a form of power that no king could take away. Through these cycles of marriage, birth, and death, Elizabeth absorbed the harsh, unspoken rules of royalty. She saw that a crown was not a shield against fear. She learned that power was both a weapon to be wielded and a wound that could destroy you. And she mastered the art of silence, realizing it was the only true armor in a court filled with whispers and spies. Denied a mother's guidance, Elizabeth became fiercely self-reliant. Denied the status of a princess, she found her worth not in titles, but in her formidable intellect. Denied the constancy of a father's love, she learned the long, difficult art of patience, of waiting for the precise right moment to act. The shadow of her father, Henry VIII, loomed over her entire life. She couldn't help but admire the magnificent, larger-than-life figure of the king, the very embodiment of royal majesty. But she also feared him deeply, for she had seen firsthand how quickly that majesty could curdle into tyranny and destroy those he claimed to love. She inherited his brilliant mind, his commanding presence, and his fearsome Tudor temper. But unlike Henry, who was ruled by his passions, Elizabeth learned the critical importance of restraint. She watched her father's whims tear the kingdom apart, and she made a silent vow. By her teenage years, Elizabeth had forged a core principle that would guide the rest of her life: survival, and any hope of future greatness depended on absolute self-control. She would not be consumed by reckless passion, as her mother had been. She would not be undone by youthful indiscretion, as Catherine Howard had been. She would endure. She would outlast them all. Elizabeth grew up a child of two powerful opposing forces, her father's fire and her mother's fall. Caught between the man who ordered her mother's death and the ghost of the woman she barely knew, she carved out her own unique path. It was a path of caution, of sharp perception, of quiet, unyielding resolve. She learned to mask her formidable intelligence behind a veneer of feminine grace. She understood that survival was the necessary first step toward rule. And so, while others at court scrambled for immediate glory and favor, Elizabeth learned to wait, to listen, to watch, understand the hidden currents of power. In surviving the violent storm of her father's reign, she was unknowingly preparing herself. She was honing the skills, the discipline, and the steely determination she would need to govern. No one could have known it then, but this forgotten girl, forged in the shadows of the Tudor court, was becoming a ruler who would one day command England with a mastery her father never possessed. She would rule not with impulsive passion, but with calculation. Not with brute force, but with image as her shield and intellect as her sword. The making of a queen had begun. Have you ever wondered what forges a monarch? Is it birthright alone, or something deeper? For one young princess, dismissed and declared illegitimate, her greatest weapon wasn't a crown or an army, but something she built herself, in secret, day by day. This is the story of how Elizabeth Tudor's mind became the sharpest sword in England. Long before she was queen, Elizabeth was a scholar. By the time most children were learning basic letters, she was mastering Latin, the language of power and diplomacy. Tudors were stunned. Soon, she devoured Greek, not just the words, but the philosophy woven into them. French and Italian followed, spoken with such fluency that she could charm ambassadors and outwit her rivals in their own tongue. She even learned Spanish, the language of her greatest enemy. This wasn't a hobby. This was self-armament. She was arming herself with words as surely as others armed themselves with steel. Her most famous tutor, Roger Ascham, said she had no equal. He described a girl with a relentless hunger for knowledge. While others found lessons tedious, Elizabeth saw them as mountains to conquer. Imagine this. She would take a passage from the Bible in Greek, translate it into elegant English, and then reforge it into Latin. This was a feat that would make a university professor sweat, yet she did it as part of her daily routine. Her mind was a furnace, and she was the master blacksmith, but her education went far beyond languages. At a time when Europe was being torn apart by the Reformation, Elizabeth dove headfirst into theology. She wanted to understand the very arguments that made kingdoms rise and fall. She studied mathematics, astronomy, and rhetoric, the art of persuasion. She even mastered music, playing the virginals and the lute, with a precision that mirrored the discipline of her mind. Her handwriting, neat and deliberate, filled notebook after notebook with essays, prayers, and translations. These weren't idle scribbles. They were the work of a girl who sensed deep in her bones that her intellect was her only true shield. In the treacherous court of Henry VIII, where queens could lose their heads on a whim and alliances shifted like desert sands, knowledge wasn't a luxury. It was survival. Elizabeth understood this better than anyone. She learned that wit, words, and logic could be her sharpest weapons. This bred a special kind of cunning in her. As a girl, she rarely spoke in public, but when she did, every word was measured, polished, and purposeful. She became a master of restraint, learning to watch and listen while others carelessly revealed their weaknesses. She studied human nature with the same intensity she studied Cicero and Aristotle, learning to read people as well as she read books. For Elizabeth, the words of the ancient world were not dead relics. They were living guides. She absorbed Cicero's speeches as if preparing for her own political battles. She sought wisdom in Plato's philosophy to guide a future reign, and she dissected Aristotle's logic to sharpen her own strategies. This wasn't just learning for learning's sake. It was a deliberate act of creation. The girl dismissed as the illegitimate daughter of Anne Boleyn was, through sheer force of will, transforming herself into one of the most formidable minds in all of Europe. Every page she turned, every language she mastered, was another stone laid in the foundation of the queen she would become. Then, when Elizabeth was 10, her world shifted again. Her father, King Henry VIII, married his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr. Catherine was unlike the stepmothers who came before her. She was brilliant, compassionate, and a passionate advocate for education. For Elizabeth, who had grown up surrounded by loss and suspicion, Catherine's arrival was like the sun breaking through the clouds. Finally, she had a mother figure who saw her not as a threat, but as a daughter to be nurtured. Catherine Parr's household became a sanctuary of learning. It was a world of books, music, and spirited debate, filled with scholars and theologians. Here, Elizabeth didn't just continue her studies, she flourished. Her mind already sharp was honed even further. Catherine herself was a published author, the first woman in England to publish a book in English under her own name. She was living proof that a woman's intellect was a source of strength, not a liability. For Elizabeth, this was a powerful, life-changing example. But Catherine gave Elizabeth more than just intellectual encouragement. With grace and quiet persistence, she convinced King Henry to reconcile with his daughters. The Third Succession Act of 1543 legally restored both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession. Though still officially illegitimate, Elizabeth was no longer an outcast. She was back in the orbit of the throne. It was a political masterstroke, a gift of incalculable value. It was a shield, a recognition that the daughter of Anne Boleyn could not be ignored. Even as a child, Elizabeth must have understood the monumental importance of this act. Her path to the throne, once blocked, was now a possibility. But shadows always lingered in the Tudor court. In 1547, Henry VIII died, leaving Catherine a dowager queen and Elizabeth once again in a world of uncertainty. Yet, the work had been done. In the quiet halls of the palace, through long hours spent with books and brilliant minds, Elizabeth had forged her greatest asset. She was no longer just a princess. She was a scholar, a strategist, a survivor. She was shaping the greatest weapon of her reign, her own extraordinary mind. She was a young princess, finding a rare moment of stability in the household of her final stepmother, Catherine Parr. But in the Tudor court, stability was always fleeting, and shadows were never far behind. Catherine Parr had scarcely been widowed a year before she married again with startling speed. Her new husband was Thomas Seymour, the brother of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third queen and mother of the boy king, Edward VI. Thomas Seymour was everything Elizabeth had been warned against: handsome, charismatic, restless, and utterly reckless. He was nearly 40. Elizabeth was just 14. What began as light-hearted familiarity soon slid into something far more dangerous. Seymour would make early morning visits to her chambers, sometimes in his nightgown. There were playful games in the gardens, roughhousing, tickling, and wrestling that went far beyond propriety. At first, Elizabeth may have been flattered. She was a teenager who had grown up under a cloud of suspicion, rarely treated with genuine affection by men who saw her only as a threat or a political pawn. Seymour's attention was intoxicating, a taste of warmth in a world that had offered her so little. But it was peril in disguise. Catherine Parr, at first, seemed indulgent, sometimes even joining in her husband's games. Yet as whispers spread through the household and the impropriety grew undeniable, her patience fractured. Jealousy and fear crept in. Elizabeth's reputation, so carefully guarded, was now in jeopardy. Catherine, torn between love for her husband and her duty as a guardian, made a painful decision. Elizabeth was sent away from the only real home she'd known. For the girl who had finally found something like a mother in Catherine, the dismissal was both heartbreak and betrayal. It may well have saved her. Tragedy struck soon after. In 1548, Catherine Parr died in childbirth. Her brief, fraught happiness with Thomas Seymour ended in sorrow. Freed from his wife's restraint, Seymour turned his ambitions once more toward Elizabeth. Rumors spread that he hoped to marry her to claim power through her royal blood. His schemes, reckless and ill-conceived, quickly drew the attention of the Regency Council. By early 1549, Seymour was arrested for treason. Elizabeth, now barely 15, was dragged into the storm. She was interrogated harshly at Hatfield, her servants arrested, her every move scrutinized. They pressed her to confess her involvement with Seymour. This was the first great test of her life, and her intellect and instinct for survival shone through. She spoke carefully, with the poise of someone far beyond her years. When accused, she replied simply, "I will not confess more than I know. If you prove anything by me, you may." She refused to be trapped or intimidated. Her incredible restraint and self-control saved her. Seymour was executed, and Elizabeth, though scarred by the scandal, emerged unbroken. She had learned, through pain and humiliation, one of the most enduring lessons of her life: to trust no man's affections too quickly, to guard her reputation with steel, and to wield silence as a shield. From Catherine Parr, Elizabeth had gained warmth, faith, and a living example of a woman navigating the perilous world of men with dignity and intellect. From the Seymour scandal, she learned the darker truth, that affection could be a weapon. It and rumor could destroy a princess as swiftly as an axe could fell a queen. In that crucible of affection and betrayal, her character was forged. She emerged not as a broken child, but as a cautious, calculating young woman. The household of Catherine Parr had given Elizabeth both her brightest refuge and her darkest lesson. From its light and shadow, the future queen began to take her true shape. The death of Henry VIII in January 1547 had already marked a turning point. Not just for England, but for Elizabeth herself. She was just 13. Now, the throne passed to her younger half-brother, Edward VI, a boy of 9. The kingdom that Henry had torn apart through war and will was now in the hands of a child, and the futures of his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, hung once more in the balance. Edward was precocious, intelligent, and fiercely Protestant. He adored Scripture, delighted in sermons, and saw himself as a reforming king, chosen by God to complete his father's break from Rome. But Edward was no true sovereign in practice. His power was wielded through his regents, first his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and later the ruthless John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Their rivalries filled the court with deadly intrigue. For Elizabeth, Edward's reign was a paradox safer than her father's, but no less perilous. Henry's moods had killed. Edward's ministers plotted. Under the boy king, England convulsed in religious upheaval. The Protestant Reformation advanced faster and fiercer than ever before. The Latin Mass was abolished, altars were torn down, and images of saints were smashed. The Book of Common Prayer, written in English, replaced centuries of Latin ritual. The countryside seethed. In Devon and Cornwall, peasants rose in rebellion, demanding the return of the old faith. In Norfolk, rioters tore down enclosures and attacked the nobility. England burned with unrest. Amid this chaos, Elizabeth, born of Anne Boleyn's defiance and educated in Catherine Parr's reformist spirit, had natural sympathy for the Protestant cause. She read scripture daily and translated devotional texts. Yet she also understood that zeal could destroy as easily as heresy. And so she adopted what would become the defining rhythm of her reign: outward compliance, inward caution. She attended Protestant services and followed the new rituals, giving no cause for suspicion. But she never bound herself so tightly to one creed that she couldn't step back if the tides of power shifted. This graceful dance along the edge of a blade was the secret to her survival. During much of Edward's reign, Elizabeth wisely kept her distance from the court, choosing the quieter refuge of her estates, especially Hatfield House. There, away from the poisonous ambitions of Somerset and Dudley, she returned to her greatest strength: learning. Hatfield was no idle retreat. It was her training ground. She honed her intellect in languages, philosophy, and theology, but also learned the practical art of governance. She studied how to manage accounts, oversee estates, and correspond with powerful figure skills that would one day prove the foundation of her monarchy. In the calm of Hatfield's libraries and gardens, Elizabeth found both safety and purpose. While England trembled with reform and rebellion, she was building something far more enduring: herself. She was learning that in the Tudor court, survival demanded more than courage. It demanded control. And it was this control, this mastery of self, that would prepare her for the even greater storms that were yet to come. A young woman whose early years were not a fairy tale, but a brutal apprenticeship for power. This is the story of Elizabeth Tudor before the crown. The quiet walls of Hatfield House weren't a prison for the young Elizabeth. They were her training ground. Long before she ruled an empire, she learned to rule her own world. She managed her household with the precision of a general, overseeing accounts, commanding servants, and maintaining perfect order. These weren't just domestic chores. They were rehearsals for governance. Hatfield became her own miniature court, a magnet for scholars, musicians, and courtiers drawn to the princess's quiet brilliance. Ambassadors would visit, expecting a girl, and leave astonished, having debated with a mind as sharp as it was graceful. Hatfield was both her sanctuary and her school, a place to reflect on the fragile threads of her destiny. According to her father Henry VIII's will, Elizabeth was second in line to the throne after her sister, Mary. But there was a catch. Both daughters were still technically illegitimate. Her claim to the crown rested not on law, but on the parchment of a dead king's will, a flimsy shield against the ambitions of the living. Elizabeth, with her trademark foresight, knew that books and wit alone wouldn't secure her future. She had to wait for opportunity to knock, for fate to unlatch the door. During the reign of her younger brother, King Edward VI, Elizabeth walked a razor's edge. Her older sister, Mary, a devout Catholic, openly defied the new Protestant reforms. But Elizabeth, though leaning towards reform herself, never broke with Mary. She visited her, wrote warm letters, and skillfully avoided being dragged into religious disputes. It was a masterclass in youthful diplomacy. By refusing to take a definitive side, she earned a rare reputation: a tutor who could unite what religion had torn apart. Under Edward's brief 6-year rule, Elizabeth perfected the art of survival. She learned that silence could be more powerful than a speech, that obedience could be a mask for unwavering principles, and that patience was the ultimate form of strength. She had watched queens rise and fall, seen her own mother executed, and stepmothers buried. From those ashes she forged a creed: to survive is an art form. She was playing the long game, waiting for her moment. As King Edward's health began to fail, the court once again spiraled into chaos. Behind the dying boy king stood men of ruthless ambition, chief among them John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland. He saw Elizabeth for the threat she was: intelligent, popular, and Protestant-leaning. Controlling her would mean ultimate power. Provoking her could mean ruin. The question of succession became the axis upon which all of England turned. Henry VIII's will had been clear: Mary, then Elizabeth. But Northumberland had his own agenda. Mary was a Catholic, and Elizabeth was no one's puppet. So he chose another candidate, the young, pious, and Protestant Lady Jane Grey, who also happened to be his daughter-in-law. He convinced the dying Edward to alter the succession. With a trembling hand, the young king struck his own sisters from history, erasing 2 daughters of Henry VIII with a few strokes of ink. For Elizabeth, this was a chilling lesson. She saw just how fragile royal blood and rightful claims could be. She watched as crowns were stolen and destinies rewritten. Realizing that sentiment and justice meant little in the face of raw power, the throne that had sometimes seemed so close could vanish in an instant, snatched away before it ever touched her brow. She was no longer just a princess. She was a pawn on a chessboard, a piece to be moved, threatened, or sacrificed at will. And yet, Elizabeth endured. She didn't rebel or protest. She simply withdrew to Hatfield, the one place she could think, breathe, and wait. She understood what others didn't. Her greatest weapon was patience. While others schemed and plotted, Elizabeth listened to the whispers of opportunity, to the turning of fate's great wheel. In that calculated silence, she prepared. Survival was no longer just a goal. It was the foundation upon which a queen would rise. The world had not yet seen what she was capable of, but her time was coming. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the past. The brief reign of Edward VI etched indelible lessons into Elizabeth's heart. She saw that even kings could be manipulated, their thrones controlled by powerful counselors. She witnessed how religion could divide families, setting brother against sister, father's will against God's command. And she felt deeply how fragile her own place was in the Tudor world. She had been restored to the succession, but just as easily, she had been cut out again. Elizabeth was learning, always learning. She carried within her the memory of Seymour's fall, the shadow of gossip, the knowledge that even innocence offered no protection. She carried, too, the bitter reminder that titles, promises, and laws could be overturned in a heartbeat. These years left her weary, but they also left her strong. The girl who once wept at her mother's death now stood with a quiet, unbreakable resolve. In silence, in study, in the practice of restraint, Elizabeth forged the tools she would one day wield as queen. Every suspicion survived, became another stone in the fortress of her character. By the time Edward VI's brief and troubled reign came to an end in 1553, Elizabeth Tudor had reached the cusp of womanhood. Nearly 20 years old, she carried the weight of experiences that had shaped her far beyond her years. She had lived through the maelstrom of Henry VIII's court, the beheadings of her mother, Anne Boleyn, and the tragic fates of her stepmothers. She had endured the unpredictable tempers of a father who could be both affectionate and tyrannical. She had survived the unsettling attentions of Thomas Seymour, which tested both her composure and her understanding of danger. And she had witnessed the calculated, often ruthless, machinations of Edward VI's regentsmen, who wielded power in his name while constantly testing the boundaries of loyalty, obedience, and ambition. Elizabeth had seen how quickly fortunes could shift, how easily trust could become betrayal, how a single misstep, a single ill-timed word or glance could bring ruin. She had watched as friends, allies, and even those closest to her were destroyed, their heads falling or reputations shattered. She had understood that survival demanded more than courage, demanded discipline, strategy, and perception. From her earliest years, Elizabeth had learned to read the motives of others. She observed Henry's court and realized that affection was often transactional, that flattery could hide deadly intent, and that the favor of a monarch was as fleeting as candlelight. She learned to recognize danger in smiles, ambition in whispers, and manipulation in seemingly innocent gestures. In the Seymour scandal, she understood that charm could be a trap, and that the cleverest strategy was to remain calm, measured, and silent when required. Elizabeth also learned the delicate art of the public versus the private persona. To the court she projected compliance and obedience. In her own household and studies, she nurtured intellect, ambition, and independence. Her education became not simply a scholarly pursuit, but a shield and a tool, allowing her to wield words as weapons, conversation as armor, and knowledge as authority. She could charm ambassadors, impress tutors, maintain her image as a harmless princess, while quietly plotting, learning, and waiting for her opportunity. She had witnessed the lethal intersection of religion and politics. Edward's Protestant reforms had sparked rebellion and unrest. Yet Elizabeth had navigated these turbulent waters with care, avoiding extreme displays of zeal that might endanger her while still embracing enough of reformist thought to maintain favor. She understood that flexibility was as important as principle, that survival required judgment in every thought, every act, every word spoken aloud. By now, Elizabeth had become a student of human nature, a keen observer of power, ambition, and deceit. She understood the fragility of life, the volatility of fortune, and the importance of timing. She could wait, she could deflect, she could appear harmless, while strengthening her position for the future. And in this crucible of adversity, Elizabeth had transformed from a princess at risk into a master of survival. She had endured scandal, temptation, and political intrigue. She had navigated the perilous labyrinths of succession and courtly life, and she had emerged unbroken, tempered by adversity, sharpened by observation, and fortified by experience. By the time Edward VI's life ended, the girl who had once been a pawn in the dangerous game of the Tudor court was no longer just a princess in waiting. She was a young woman of extraordinary resilience, intelligence, and foresight, a queen in all but name. Prepared to seize power not through force, but through cunning, wisdom, and the careful orchestration of circumstance. Every lesson she had learned, every slight, every threat, every secret observation had become a building block in the fortress of her character, preparing her to step onto a throne that would demand all her skill, patience, and strategic genius. Elizabeth Tudor had survived, and in her survival lay the foundation for the reign that would come, a reign that would become legendary, unrivaled, and forever remembered as the Golden Age of England. The Elizabeth who emerged from the reigns of Henry VIII and Edward VI was not yet the queen history remembers. She was a young woman, vulnerable, often in peril, yet already marked by the qualities that would define her: intelligence, resilience, and a shrewd instinct for survival. The shadow of the throne had not destroyed her. Instead, it had taught her the lessons she would need to one day sit upon it. But her greatest trial was yet to come. With Edward's death, the throne passed not to Elizabeth, but to her Catholic half-sister Mary. And under Mary's reign, Elizabeth would face imprisonment, suspicion of treason, and the very real threat of execution. The stage was set for the next chapter in her journey, a chapter where survival itself would hang by a thread. Elizabeth Tudor's survival had already tested her wit, her discipline, and her caution. But with the death of Edward VI in July 1553, the true crucible of her life began. The crown of England passed not to Elizabeth or to her elder sister Mary by right of Henry VIII's will, but first, for 9 fleeting days, to Lady Jane Grey, pawn of John Dudley's ambition. Elizabeth's response to Jane's usurpation was measured and deliberate. She did not rush to declare herself, nor did she openly rebel. Instead, she watched and waited, calculating the safest course. When Mary raised her standard and gathered supporters, Elizabeth chose her side carefully. She marched to greet Mary in a display of loyalty that was both political and prudent. Riding into London with her sister, cheered by crowds that hailed them as the true heirs. The winter of 1558 settled over England like a shroud. The days were short, the nights long, and a chill crept not only into hearth and home, but into the very spirit of the realm. In London, the air hung heavy with smoke from damp fires, mingling with whispers of rumor and dread. For in the chambers of St. James's Palace, a queen lay dying. Mary Tudor, the first woman to sit upon the throne of England by right of blood, had fought fiercely to rule as her father. Henry VIII once had, with strength, conviction, and unflinching faith. Yet her reign had been marked not by triumph, but by sorrow. The people called her Bloody Mary, a name born of the fire and smoke of Smithfield, where men and women were burned alive for refusing to bend their conscience to Rome. Her health, too, had betrayed her. A A phantom pregnancy left her body frail and her spirit wounded. The loss of Calais, England's last foothold on the continent, was a humiliation she confessed would be found engraved upon her heart. Childless, sickly, and surrounded by courtiers who whispered behind her back, Mary's last days were darkened by failure. Outside her chambers, England held its breath. The question of succession was a question of life and death. Spain watched anxiously, for Mary's husband, Philip II, had hoped to bind England to his empire. France plotted, for Mary, Queen of Scots, had a claim that could rally Catholic Europe. Far from these dying embers of power, at Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, another woman waited. She was 25 years old, tall, with fiery red hair, sharp eyes, and a mind trained in silence, study, and survival. She was Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the Queen executed as a traitor, and Henry VIII, the king whose will had reshaped church and crown alike. To many, Elizabeth was still tainted by scandal. To others, she was a beacon of hope. To herself, she was cautious, wary, and patient. She had learned long ago that in the deadly game of thrones, survival was the first victory. Though they were sisters, daughters of the formidable Henry VIII, the gulf between them was vast. Beneath the surface of any shared royal blood, Elizabeth understood the peril she was in. Mary, now crowned, faced an almost impossible challenge. She was a woman on a throne in a world that doubted female authority, devout Catholic in a kingdom fractured by faith, a monarch bound by both blood and suspicion. To Mary, Elizabeth, clever, Protestant-leaning, and immensely popular with the people, was not simply a sister. She was a rival. Mary's reign quickly became entangled with controversy. Her marriage to Philip of Spain, a union designed to strengthen England's Catholic ties, outraged many of her subjects. The specter of foreign control, combined with the fear of England being subsumed into Habsburg politics, gave rise to open unrest. When Wyatt's rebellion broke out in 1554, a protest against the Spanish marriage, Elizabeth was immediately suspected. The rebels spoke her name, whether she had any involvement or not. Her very existence became a rallying point for opposition to Mary. Elizabeth denied everything, insisting on her loyalty. But in the treacherous world of Tudor politics, innocence meant little. She was seized, interrogated, and in a chilling echo of her mother Anne Boleyn's fate, committed to the Tower of London, as the tower gates clanged shut behind her. Elizabeth entered the same fortress where her mother had spent her final days before the executioner's axe, to walk its stone corridors, to hear its heavy doors lock. To breathe its damp, shadowed air was to feel the very breath of death itself. Elizabeth knew that one false move, one unfounded accusation, one letter discovered, could end her life on the scaffold. And yet, she endured. Summoned before interrogators, Elizabeth maintained her composure. She spoke carefully, neither too bold nor too submissive, asserting her innocence while refusing to incriminate herself. When asked if she supported the rebels, she answered with chilling precision, "I am not guilty of this thing." She refused to be trapped by leading questions, refused to sign false confessions, refused to give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her fear. It was here, in the cold cells of the tower, that Elizabeth's steel was truly tested. She understood that to panic was to perish. She cultivated patience, silence, and above all, restraint. She prayed, she read her Bible, and she waited for fate to turn. Whether out of a lack of evidence, political calculation, or Mary's own conflicted conscience, Elizabeth was eventually released, though not to freedom. She was sent instead to house arrest at Woodstock, closely monitored. Her letters were censored, her every step shadowed by spies. She lived in a cage gilded but suffocating, where even servants might betray her for a coin or a favor. Yet in confinement, Elizabeth's resilience only grew. She charmed her guards, cultivated an image of dutiful obedience, and waited. In public, she bowed to Mary's authority, but in private, she studied, observed, and prepared for the day when the crown might fall into her hands. Meanwhile, Mary's reign grew darker. The burnings of Protestant heretics cemented her grim title. The people who had once cheered her entry into London began to recoil from the smoke and flames of martyrdom. Each execution weakened her popularity, and each failure of policy drove the nation further into discontent. Elizabeth, by contrast, became a figure of silent hope. She was the alternative, the Protestant heir, the daughter of an bull untarnished, yes, but alive. And with every year that Mary's marriage failed to produce a child, Elizabeth's shadow loomed larger over the throne. By the time Mary's health began to fail in 1558, Elizabeth had endured it all: imprisonment, suspicion, and confinement. She had seen the cruelty of power misused, the danger of foreign alliances, and the futility of ruling by fear. She had learned that a queen must balance strength with mercy, faith with pragmatism, and caution with decisiveness. And so, when Mary Tudor died in November 1558, Elizabeth emerged from the shadows. The girl who had once been led through the Traitor's Gate as a prisoner, now prepared to enter London as its queen. The lessons of Mary's reign were carved deep into her heart. That queenship was fraught with peril, that to wear the crown was to walk, always on a knife's edge, and that survival demanded not only wisdom, but vision. Elizabeth had seen the dangers of queenship in her sister's struggles. Now, she was ready to face those dangers herself, and to transform them into a triumph that would echo for centuries. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories from history. We'll see you next time.